On February 24, 1868, Andrew Johnson becomes the first U.S. president to be impeached. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Johnson, a Tennessean, was the only U.S. senator from a seceding state who remained loyal to the Union. Although a Democrat, in 1864 he was elected vice president for Republican Abraham Lincoln's second term as part of a national Union ticket. Johnson became president after Lincoln's assassination in 1865. Johnson did not see eye to eye with the Republican-dominated Congress, which was pushing Reconstruction policies. Johnson frequently vetoed bills passed by Congress, and Congress, in turn, frequently overrode his vetoes by the required two-thirds vote. In total, Johnson vetoed bills sent to his desk 21 times. 15 of those were overridden by Congress. He also had 8 pocket vetoes, which is where a president refuses to sign a bill until the current session of Congress ends. The bill essentially times out and cannot be overridden. Johnson's 29 total vetoes may seem like a lot, but other presidents have had far more. Franklin Roosevelt tops the list. In a way, this isn't surprising since he had the longest tenure as president, just over 12 years. But his number absolutely dwarfs Johnson's. FDR had a staggering 372 regular vetoes and 263 pocket vetoes, for a grand total of 635. Only 9 of his vetoes were overridden. Roosevelt's veto numbers are especially noteworthy since he was a Democrat and enjoyed a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress during his entire tenure. Grover Cleveland, in his 2 non-consecutive terms, comes in second on the veto list with 346 regular vetoes and 238 pocket vetoes, for a total of 584. Okay, back to Andrew Johnson's impeachment. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, overriding a Johnson veto to do so. The U.S. Constitution requires the president to get Senate approval for each cabinet appointment. The Tenure of Office Act took things further, requiring the president to get the Senate's permission to remove a cabinet member. Congress created the law because its members hated Johnson. They were setting him up. By the way, this act has since been repealed, first in part and later in full, and declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But it is in place when Johnson removed Lincoln holdover Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War, thus violating the Tenure of Office Act. It was the last straw for House Republicans. They approved 11 articles of impeachment, 9 of which related directly to Stanton's removal. Of course, despite popular misunderstanding, impeachment does not mean removal from office. The House impeaches, which brings formal charges. Impeachment requires only a simple majority in the House. Then a trial is held in the Senate where a 2/3 majority is required to convict and remove from office. Johnson's Senate trial began on March 5, 1868. The president was wisely kept away from the proceedings by his lawyers. They feared he'd lose his temper and sabotage the defense. The trial lasted more than 2 months. Ultimately, the Senate fell 1 vote short of the 2/3 majority needed to remove Johnson. Only 2 presidents since Johnson have been impeached, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. Like Johnson, they were both acquitted by the Senate, Trump twice. There is near consensus that Johnson was a terrible president, one of the worst in U.S. history. He is routinely ranked near the bottom by most historians, along with names like Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and Warren G. Harding. Why? Well, for starters, he was ineffective and could not work with Congress. He tried to block post-Civil War Reconstruction by vetoing 20 different Reconstruction-related bills. He urged Southern legislatures to reject the 14th Amendment, which made blacks U.S. citizens and included the Equal Protection Clause. He ordered black families evicted from land on which the U.S. Army had settled them. So, awful president. But should Andrew Johnson have been impeached? Well, The Constitution sets the bar for impeachment at high crimes and misdemeanors. Ultimately, Johnson was impeached because of his policy differences with Congress, and it is hard to argue this rises to high crimes and misdemeanors. As far as accomplishments for Johnson as president, there aren't many. The biggest would have to be the 1867 purchase of Alaska from Russia, which was engineered by Secretary of State William Seward, who gets most of the credit, and rightfully so. At first, the deal was lampooned as Seward's folly. Before long, the move was viewed as a brilliant one. Actually, Seward's goal in acquiring Alaska had nothing to do with why the U.S. values Alaska today. He was secretly hoping to eventually absorb Canada, and Alaska positioned the U.S. to do so. Britain, however, outflanked Seward by giving Canada home rule a few months after the U.S.'s purchase of Alaska. A U.S. invasion of Canada could no longer be seen as a liberation from British tyranny, but would be an invasion of a sovereign land. Still, Johnson, as U.S. president at the time, deserves some credit for Alaska. Knowing that Republicans despised him, Johnson actually sought the 1868 Democratic nomination for president, but lost to New York Governor Horatio Seymour, who in turn lost the general election to Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant. It's disappointing in a way because if Seymour had won, he would have become a legitimate contender for best facial hair in presidential history, thanks to his epic neck beard. Seymour would have been right there with Martin Van Buren, whose impressive sideburns place him squarely at number 1. After his term ended, Johnson went back to Tennessee. However, he wanted to get back into Congress, hoping to vindicate himself. He lost a bid for the Senate in 1869 and the House in 1872. He was eventually elected to the Senate in 1875. Remember that back then, state legislatures still elected U.S. senators. Not surprisingly, he received a rather cool reception from his fellow senators. A few of them, including some of his former rivals, did at least go over and shake his hand. Johnson is the only former U.S. president to serve in the U.S. Senate after leaving office. Few presidents, in fact, have served in any kind of defined federal capacity after leaving office. John Quincy Adams, though, did spend time in the U.S. House of Representatives post-presidency. Former President John Tyler was elected to the Confederate Congress, but died before assuming office. William Howard Taft had the most prestigious post-presidential run, serving 9 years as Chief Justice of the United States, in fact serving in the capacity when the Tenure of Office Act was declared unconstitutional. Andrew Johnson's time in the U.S. Senate was, however, rather short. He suffered a stroke just 4 months after taking office and died the following month at age 66. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1803, the Marbury v. Madison decision establishes the U.S. Supreme Court's power of judicial review. In 1836, Colonel William Travis issues a call for help on behalf of the Texas troops defending the Alamo. In 1864, Rebecca Lee Crumpler becomes the first black woman in the U.S. to become a doctor of medicine. In 1942, the U.S. makes its first Voice of America radio broadcast in German to counter Nazi propaganda. In 1991, U.S.-led coalition forces launch a ground invasion against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the Gulf War. In 2020, Iran announces that the country has 61 known cases of COVID-19 and has had 12 deaths. In 2022, war begins as Russian troops launch a wide-ranging pre-dawn attack on Ukraine. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. Which U.S. president established Grand Canyon National Park? Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, or Warren G. Harding? Think you know the answer? Drop your guesses in the comments below. Find out if you're right next time on Today in History.